April 4th, 1945. Spring had come to central Germany. The snow had melted, fields were turning green. Villages looked untouched from a distance. Red rooftops, church steeples, flower boxes beginning to bloom. To a passing convoy, it might have seemed like the war was almost over. And in many ways it was. The Third Reich was collapsing. Allied forces were advancing from every direction. German resistance was weakening. Surrenders were becoming common. But on a quiet road near the town of Gotha, something stopped American soldiers in their tracks. It wasn't gunfire. It wasn't a barricade. It was a smell. At first, no one could place it. Soldiers joked nervously that maybe it was a glue factory or spoiled livestock. But the deeper they drove into the countryside, the heavier the air became. Men began covering their noses. Some gagged. Veterans who had marched through battlefields filled with corpses found this different. Thicker, sweeter, unmistakably wrong. General George S. Patton was moving through the region with elements of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. When officers reported the stench, he demanded answers. Find out what that is. A reconnaissance jeep returned hours later. The officer inside was pale. He wasn't describing enemy artillery. He wasn't describing tanks. He simply said, "General, you need to see this." The place was called Ohrdruf. It was a subcamp of Buchenwald, and it would become the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces on the Western Front. When American troops entered the perimeter, the SS guards had already fled. But they had not left quietly. In their final hours, they attempted to erase evidence. Prisoners too weak to march had been executed. Bodies were stacked hastily. Lime had been scattered in places to slow decomposition. But they ran out of time. What the Americans found inside the wire would permanently change how they understood the war. There were survivors, but barely. Men reduced to skin and bone. Hollow eyes. Prison uniforms hanging like rags on skeletal frames. Many were too weak to celebrate liberation. Some simply reached out and touched the American tanks, as if confirming the white stars were real. Others wept silently. The Americans moved deeper into the camp. They found open burial pits. They found bodies laid out in rows. They found evidence of beatings and torture. This was not a battlefield. There were no craters from artillery, no signs of chaotic crossfire. This was systematic, deliberate, organized suffering. Word spread quickly. Soon, senior commanders arrived. Dwight D, Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George Patton. These were men who had directed the largest military operation in human history. They had seen destruction across continents. They believed themselves hardened. They were not prepared. Eisenhower later wrote that what he saw beggared description. Bradley struggled to find words. Patton, known for his aggressive confidence, walked through the camp in silence. He examined the grounds. He looked at the stacked bodies. He entered a shed where corpses had been piled. At one point, according to accounts, even he became physically ill. For a man nicknamed Old Blood and Guts, this was not weakness. It was shock. But shock did not last long. It turned into something else. Rage. Not the theatrical kind. The controlled, focused kind. Because there was something else about Ohrdruf that made the horror even sharper. The town was nearby. Homes stood within a short distance. Church bells could be heard. Laundry hung from windows. Ordinary life had continued while this operated. When American officers questioned local residents, many insisted they did not know the true nature of the camp. They described it as a labor facility, a detention center, a place for criminals. They claimed they had no knowledge of executions or starvation. Patton did not believe them. He looked toward the town and reportedly said that the smell alone made ignorance impossible. He believed the proximity destroyed the excuse. Whether every citizen knew the full extent remains debated by historians. But Patton made a decision that would echo far beyond Ohrdruf. He ordered civilians from the town, including the mayor and other prominent figures, to visit the camp. This was not standard military procedure. It was not required by any regulation. It was an act of confrontation. Trucks were sent into town. Civilians were gathered. They were brought to the gates of Ohrdruf. They arrived dressed as they normally would. Coats, hats, tidy clothing. At first, some appeared confused, some offended. But once inside the camp, confusion disappeared. They were walked past the bodies, past the burial pits, past the survivors. Eyewitnesses described civilians covering their mouths. Some fainted, some wept openly, some stood motionless. American soldiers ensured that no one looked away for long. It was not meant to humiliate for spectacle. It was meant to eliminate denial. After that day, no one who had toured the camp could claim they had never seen. The mayor of Ohrdruf was among those present. Within days, he and his wife were found dead in their home. They had taken their own lives. Historians debate the reasons. Shame, fear of prosecution, collapse of ideology, personal despair. It is impossible to know the precise weight of each factor. Patton reportedly reacted with grim practicality. The war was still ongoing. There was little space for sympathy in his view. But the significance of Ohrdruf went beyond Patton's reaction. For Eisenhower, it triggered a larger realization. He understood that someday, someone would deny this. Even in 1945, that thought occurred to him. He therefore ordered extensive documentation. Photographs, film, detailed reports. He insisted that journalists and members of Congress visit liberated camps. He wanted witnesses. He wanted records that could not easily be dismissed. He wrote that he made these visits deliberately so he could testify personally if future generations attempted to call the atrocities propaganda. That foresight proved critical, because in the decades after the war, denial movements would emerge. The evidence gathered at places like Ohrdruf became part of the foundation for the Nuremberg trials. It became part of the historical record, and it changed how American soldiers understood their mission. Before entering the camps, many viewed the war strategically. After seeing Ohrdruf, it became moral. One soldier later wrote that he no longer saw the conflict as a struggle over territory, but as a fight against something fundamentally evil. Ohrdruf was not the largest camp. It was not the most infamous, but it was the first exposure for American forces. And first exposure leaves a mark that never fades. The liberation hardened attitudes. Denazification policies gained urgency. Occupation strategy shifted. The war's narrative expanded from military victory to moral reckoning. But beyond policy and strategy, Ohrdruf left a human imprint. The generals who walked those grounds carried the memory with them. The soldiers who stood among the dead understood something new about why they were there. And the civilians who were brought inside those gates could never again say they had not seen. History still wrestles with a larger question. How much did ordinary citizens know? Authoritarian regimes thrive on fear, secrecy, and propaganda. Information is fragmented. Rumors circulate. Speaking out carries risk. Self-preservation becomes powerful. But proximity complicates innocence. When smoke rises daily, when prisoners march through roads, when a smell hangs in the air, at what point does not knowing become choosing not to know? There are no simple answers. But Ohrdruf forced the question into the open. Spring continued across Germany. The trees kept blooming. But renewal would require more than the end of war. It would require confrontation with what had happened. Ohrdruf marked the beginning of that confrontation for American forces. It marked the beginning of global awareness of the camp system. And it marked the moment when denial met evidence. Eisenhower was right about one thing. There would be those who later questioned whether such crimes truly occurred. There would be those who minimized, those who distorted, those who claimed exaggeration. That is why documentation mattered. That is why witnesses mattered. And that is why memory must be preserved. Because history does not defend itself. People defend it. If stories like this are forgotten, denial becomes easier. If they are remembered, truth remains anchored. The liberation of Ohrdruf was not only a military event. It was a turning point in awareness. A moment when seasoned commanders stood in silence. When soldiers understood the moral stakes. When civilians were forced to look. And when the world began to grasp the scale of what had been hidden behind barbed wire. The war would end weeks later, but the responsibility to remember would not. If you believe moments like this must remain part of our shared memory, not softened, not erased, Consider subscribing for more in-depth explorations of World War II and the decisions that shaped the modern world. Because history is not just about battles. It is about what we choose to confront and what we choose never to ignore again.